for our COP26 post-mortem talk show. There's been a few little changes. I'll let Tatet fill you in on some of those, but you know, we're happy that everyone is joining us, and thank you to all of our panelists for being here today, for kind of sharing your experiences for those who were at COP, and some of us were just kind of following from our respective homes. I will first pass it to the director of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York office for a few welcome remarks. Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you. Yeah, good morning to the Americas, good afternoon to Europe, good evening to Asia. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to welcome you on behalf of Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York office. For those of the audience who do not know us, Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung is an international operating non-government organization based in Berlin. We are dedicated to civic education and political research. One of the programs we are running in the New York office is the dialogue program United Nations, and that is the reason why we invited a panel today to talk about the just finished Conference of Parties, the COP26 in Glasgow. We call it the Post-Mortem, which is Latin means after death. I prefer the German word autopsy, which is means autos self and opsis view, so self-seen, and that's why we invited some people who either personally or as or virtually participated in a lot of the panels and conference or parts of the conference. There has been no lack of dramatic declarations about the importance and the urgency of a bold action to fight climate change. However, the outcome, the comments about the outcome show at least few enthusiasm. Some show sober acknowledgement, some go to deep disappointment. It's safe to say that a lot will depend on the concrete action that states and companies are willing to take. It is early in the stage, and I think all the outcome that had been produced during the COP is still to be assessed. And what we want to do today is the first step, and that's why, as I said, we invited a distinguished panel to do this first assessment and give their view. And without further ado, I would like to start the round. I'm very curious. I hope the audience is too. And I turn it back to I guess, Maria, right?
Yes, thank you, Andreas. So I would just like to briefly introduce today's panel. If you guys could all turn your screens back on. First, we have Tatet Laurent, who is a consultant here with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York office, who is our UN climate guru, who follows all things related to the United Nations and their climate work. And she recently spent 2 weeks in Glasgow and is currently still self-quarantining back home in the Philippines. We also have Brandon Wu, who is the head of policy and campaigns for ActionAid USA. He did not attend COP26, but followed closely here from the United States. We also have Lucy Mulinke, who is an indigenous activist and head of the Indigenous Information Network in Kenya. She is currently calling in from the field, so we appreciate her making the time to be here with us today. And finally, we have Nassim Ashouet, the program manager at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Brussels office. Unfortunately, our colleague Dinda Yura, the director of Solidaritas Perennium, sorry, that's a mouthful, was unable to join us. She is currently ill and has not been able to return home yet from COP26. So thank you everybody for being here with us. We really appreciate you taking the time. And I will first start things off with some just questions about the event, about COP26, which was presented by the UK government as this last chance for the world to meet the goal of keeping climate change in check. Obviously, you know, like some outcomes had been heralded by the UK government and the UN overall, but I would just like to hear from each of you about what you think of what came of COP26. Tell us your thoughts about the event in and of itself, and what are your key takeaways? I will hand it over to Tet first.
Thanks very much, Maria, and hello everyone. Long time no see. It's been 3 days since we all left Glasgow, and now I'm quarantining here in Manila before I'm finally able to go back to my family, hopefully if I register a negative PCR test 2 days from now. So I think everyone has gotten a lot of news and information coming out from Glasgow, but really it would be important for us to reflect on whether Glasgow COP26 did deliver the outcomes that are needed, you know, to save people and planet from the climate crisis, from the existential crisis. So maybe let's put it in perspective. COP26 is a critical moment for all of us in the fight for climate justice, as we needed to see real support for communities in the front lines, no, from the most severe impacts of climate change. We demanded real action to transform away from polluting systems and for governments to radically cut emissions to keep to the 1.5 degrees global temperature goal alive. So 2 weeks plus 1 day overtime, what we have is the Glasgow Pact, no? And I think it would be good to see if it really provided the answers to our critical issues so that people and planet will not only survive but also thrive. For me, I think my main takeaways from Glasgow would be, number one, it did not go far enough. All of the nationally determined contributions, or the NDCs, that governments put in when they came to Glasgow, put together, is not enough. No, neither are those pledges that we heard throughout those 2 weeks of negotiations. We barely made it to the 1.5, no, with governments saying we're somewhere between 1.5 to 1.9 degrees global temperature rise, given all that has been put on the temperature goal basket, so to speak. So I think that's one key takeaway for me. We didn't go that far. We didn't go far enough. Number two, it's very important for everyone to realize that there's been a lot of pushbacks on rights and obligations. Yeah, we heard it, we saw it in the first few days of the climate talks, when a seemingly harmless track called Action for Climate Empowerment, which is basically about capacity building for climate action. It was a huge surprise for us that in climate action, the reference to human rights to guide climate action was objected to by one member state. And this was carried forward as a decision. So it's like, what is this turning out to be? No, one of the relatively harmless tracks in the negotiation, something as benign as capacity building, suddenly became so political because one member state, one government refused to acknowledge the importance of human rights in guiding climate action. So we saw that pattern throughout those 2 weeks. No, Article 6, the discussions around the role of carbon markets in climate action. There was also a lot of pushback on fundamental human rights. And so are the discussions around climate financing. So we see that many states have been really withdrawing from already agreed language. Now, I sound like a technocrat now, but the bottom line is hard-won rights that we fought for have really been under serious threat in this COP. And then probably my third takeaway is that this is the whitest COP ever that I've seen. Meaning we are really missing the voices of communities from the global south, especially. If you recall, a few months ago, civil society called for the postponement of COP, but this was not listened to by the UK COP presidency. We cited reasons of vaccine inequality and many others, but the UK COP presidency insisted that this was going to happen in person and that this was going to be the most inclusive COP ever. But that was not the case for the very few of us who managed to go to Glasgow and, you know, jump the hoops about over lots of hurdles, visa, costs, vaccines, etc. So we were really surprised that the venue was not really welcoming at all, limiting civil society participation in many important negotiation tracks. We were told to just watch the online proceedings from our hotels, but even that was not possible because the system was crashing already. Yeah, so there were so many problems, hurdles to that prevented us from meaningfully engaging inside the negotiation. So those for me were my three main takeaways from COP26. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you so much, Tatat. We really appreciate hearing your thoughts. I guess I will pass it on next to Brandon to hear your thoughts specifically around like climate finance, including loss and damage.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for having me. So I'm Brandon Wu. I'm the Director of Policy and Campaigns for ActionAid USA, and one of the key areas that my organization follows, as Maria mentioned, is finance and loss and damage. And on this COP was, I would say, a disappointment, except we didn't have huge expectations, at least on finance. Actually, on loss and damage, there was a genuine disappointment, I think. But let me start with finance. You know, this was never going to be a moment of breakthrough on climate finance, for better or worse, but there were some quite important things on the agenda. Actually, even before the COP started, there was quite a bit of attention on this new climate finance delivery plan that the COP presidency commissioned, which, as it turned out, did not deliver anything and wasn't a real plan. Instead, it mostly just made excuses for why wealthy countries have not met the $100 billion a year pledge that they made over a decade ago at this point. It said, well, maybe we'll reach it by 2023, but by the way, that's if you count an enormous amount of loans. I think 71% of what is currently being counted by wealthy countries as climate finance is in the form of loans, which of course deepens indebtedness in developing countries, and we believe shouldn't be counted as climate finance at all. So that delivery plan came out, and it was sort of touted by wealthy countries during the negotiations as, you know, we basically we apologize that we haven't met this goal yet, but here we have this plan now. And that's really all that we got out of them, was sort of they express regrets in the text that the goal has not been met, and they put out this delivery plan, which probably isn't worth a whole lot at all, especially given their accounting methodologies, which count things like loans and private finance and other dubious things that don't represent a real transfer of resources from the global north to the global south. There was a conversation about what is the goal that's going to replace the 100 billion. That goal was extended from 2020 to 2025 in the Paris Agreement, and there needs to be a conversation about what comes after. What is the collective target post 2025? And there is essentially a process set up to have that conversation. Wealthy countries are not keen to move quickly on that, of course. Let me move to loss and damage, because as I said, there was a real, I think, disappointment here. And again, it's around finance, right? So there have been conversations and technical processes set up around loss and damage over the last many, many years about how we're going to deal with impacts that are too severe for developing countries to adapt to. And for that entire time, the request from developing countries has been, we need finance for loss and damage. Yes, there are many non-economic impacts that we need to be talking about, and we need to have a plan about dealing with legal frameworks for climate-induced migration and displacement and things like that. But at the end of the day, one of the main things we need is financial support. And in our movements, we've taken to calling that reparations, right? That's really what this is about, is about reparations. And almost every single country at COP26 supported the creation of a Glasgow loss and damage facility, which would have been a financial mechanism to support finance for loss and damage. But the US, Australia, and the EU completely blocked it. It was a red line for them, totally unacceptable to them. And so we did not get a Glasgow loss and damage finance facility. Instead, what we got was language about continuing the operationalization of the Santiago network, which is sort of a technical facility, which hasn't had any financing yet. And so it's now going to get some money. And so, of course, now the US is saying, oh, well, we support loss and damage. We are funding the Santiago network, and we're funding technical assistance for loss and damage. Sure, they're giving a little bit of money for technical assistance, but they're not giving any money for the actual work of dealing with loss and damage. And so essentially what we saw was stonewalling on progress on loss and damage, as usual, from the United States, Australia, and the European Union. And so those are two really of the primary priorities for Global South countries. And we really have very little to show for coming out of COP26 on those two really, really key issues.
Thank you so much, Brandon. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. I will now pass it on to Lucy to hear her thoughts about her time at COP26, and specifically looking around nature-based solution, carbon markets, and indigenous rights. So Lucy, please take.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Ted and Brandon, for bringing out quite some issues. And indeed, yes, that COP was very interesting. First of all, the crowd that was there was terrifying. In the first few weeks, I think we had such a big crowd there that most of us wondered how we would make it throughout the 2 weeks because of looking at the entrance to the meeting rooms, access inside. There were so many people. I think I'm saying this because it's very important when you look at, especially, for example, for us who are very much involved with indigenous communities, and we always want the indigenous women to attend and so on. So it was quite of an interest, and also it was quite a challenge sometimes to get into the areas to be able to listen to some of the key issues, especially where the real plenary was taking place. It was not just easy for every other time because they use either you had the cards to get into some of the meetings, or you couldn't actually go very easily face to face, which I found it a bit interesting. So it's also something that doesn't give all the information and so on. As Ted had already said, I think some of the discussion you would rather have listened by online and watch it and be able to go to different meetings online. For the indigenous people, we had our own caucuses and we had our briefs every other time. At the same time, we had selected already people to attend different like Article 6, and also to be able to go to carbon markets and to be able to go to different finance and so on, simply because of that limitation. In some areas, you are supposed to have some cards. So it was also limiting. You can't just walk in and say you are going to work, because of the number of people they were trying also to avoid, which I don't think they succeeded a lot at many times. Now, one of the, so it was actually a bit more easier to listen, to listen it virtually. But one of the main problem that I found it is that it was not very engaging when you want to do advocacy work inside to hear and talk to the government and be able to go to the plenary and listen and bring out some issues. But the most interesting thing that I got was the side events. The different side events that were there were very, very interesting. And I think that's where we got most of the information, most of the issues that were being discussed, which I found it very good for different people. And we told our delegation, the young ladies whom we had gone to go to those particular side events, because that's where they could gain a lot of knowledge in terms of listening to them. There were quite many, but very interesting and also very educative, and could bring people up to date with the issue of looking at different issues when it comes to carbon and credits, and also on finance and so on. Remember also during this time, there were pledges that were done for indigenous people, the billions that were done already. But we also were asking ourselves, these billions for indigenous people, is it new money, or is it the old money that has always been there and we don't know it, and now it's here again being repledged again and given to the indigenous people for different activities, and how is that going to be implemented? And we were very conscious on that, and indigenous people were really discussing and saying, how do we have, how can we try to look at how we can track this particular funding? Because the funding is there, they can mention, they can pledge, but without our own self, this funding never reaches the people on the ground, the remote communities on the ground. So we are still worried about that, whether it's going to be really implemented or so on. I also think that for now, as the conference has just ended, according to me, I feel like we need time to look at critically on the outcome of Glasgow, look at it and see what is this outcome and how is it going to impact on us as indigenous communities down on the ground, and how do we really follow up, how do we monitor what's going to be on. So I would really wish that maybe after we really scrutinize or look carefully or the outcome, because it's just a few days when we finish the conference and now we are back, and some of us are out already in the field, we haven't looked at it very critically to be able to see whether this is something that is going to be really, we can be able to focus and see how we can pick it up and follow up and be able to really have the implementation process start off. But the good thing is that the network is still working with the forum, both the indigenous forum and also the African forum, that networking that we have already started there, so that we can be able to prepare ourselves step by step before the next meeting in next year, Sharm el-Sheikh. But it was quite an experience. I've been to the COP before, some years back before, but this time it was really a different COP, because lots of expectations, we thought that this could really go very smoothly and be able to benefit a lot in terms of information and in terms of seeing the processes the way they are. But it also turned up to be, it's one of the COPs after COVID, and so everybody wanted to be there. Unfortunately for us also in the caucus, we had a few of our colleagues who had COVID while they were there. So the last 3 days or so, we only had to do virtual meetings and didn't meet face to face, because we wanted to make sure that we are all safe before we return home. So I think that's what I want to pick up for now. And maybe later on, as we discuss, we can try to see how it is. But for indigenous communities, I think we needed to be more focused. We need to be a bit more focused and see how we can be able to plan and to have some pre-meeting in advance, and continuously as we continue with the meeting, to be able to brief the communities and to see where we are in terms of the process of the Conference of Parties, because it's quite different from the other processes in the Conference of Parties on biodiversity and so on. This number was really big. I think I'll stop here for some time, and then I can be able to continue further. So for the questions you had, I think for me it's a bit too early to see whether indigenous people really think that this will benefit them, or carbon trade, how they will work on it, because it's something that we are all still digesting and trying to get some recommendation, some views from our own colleagues who are following up the process in different areas of discussion there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. We really appreciate hearing your thoughts, and totally agree that, we're only a few days out since the end of COP. So I think really kind of understanding the impact and what these outcomes mean will take a little bit of time to figure out. Now I would like to pass the mic to my colleague Nassim in Brussels and hear what he has to say specifically around like net zero and just transition issues. Take it away, Nassim.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you for the invitation to my colleagues in New York and to TED. It's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this panel. I would also ask to bear with me if my voice or my energy level is not sometimes so high. I just came back yesterday from Glasgow, and maybe got a cold probably, but as you can see, I'm staying in my room, so no worries. So yeah, a lot has already been said by the previous panelists, and I'm also less experienced. It's only my second COP, but I have some takeaways around maybe the bigger picture, and what we can see is that we can adapt that the COP is a space where we will see the decision taken to operate even the start of a real systemic change that will need to happen to have a chance to keep the climate crisis somehow under control and the rise of the global temperature under 1.5 degrees. So it has already been said, but from the Article 6 to the net zero trap, as well as the untouched NDCs, we have seen, I think, in those 2 weeks, the unwillingness of major powers and Western states to leave space to any rebalancing of power and wealth, and to act beyond somehow what the political elite of those countries has defined as their geopolitical interests, which is often represented by the protection of their energy mix, as well as their and the corporation vested interests that they represent. So I've been asked to focus a bit on the 2 points, and I think on the question of just transition, that has been also portrayed as kind of a positive outcome of this COP, and I think there is some positive advancements, as we've seen that the final text in the pact was mentioning the need to ensure a just transitions toward a low carbon future and the creation of decent work and quality jobs. And this has been somehow alluded by the trade union movement, but it's sadly also vague enough to be abused to argue for paying compensations for the industries and their financials for lost future income. And we can also argue and wonder, what does it really mean when we haven't been able, or the northern countries haven't been able to reach the 100 billion per year as climate finance, as Brian was mentioning before, or to actually come up with NDCs that would be in line with Paris Agreement. And as it was said, mentioned by TED, we are currently heading towards between 2.4 and 2.7 degrees. Or when we are saying that carbon markets are also set up to make sure that it will leave some space for polluters to continue doing so. So what a just transition means in this situation for the workers and also the communities in the global south that are being impacted and that will continue to be impacted so much by the climate change effects in the future. I think that's something we can ask ourselves. So there is the risk, I think, that the transition language could be co-opted by corporate powers in the future. Another points that have been all over the media as well was the announcement around the net zero goals, and we've heard about the at the start of the COP, the announcement about India being net zero in 2070, and just days before the COP, Saudi Arabia declared also net zero goal by 2060. But what we also know is that net zero means that fossil fuel companies can continue to explore, drill, extract, and burn fossil fuels, while there is somehow in place installations that would suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, balancing out emissions. So I think that we also need to be very careful and cautious around those net zero pledges, and to try also as movement to really ask as to a proper decrease of fossil fuel production and burning. We know that if states really want to avoid going beyond 1.5 of warming, they would commit themselves to organizing and planning the decrease of the world oil and gas productions of 3% per year until 2050, and of 7% for coal, as it is recommended by scientists. But as a very short, but because I think we will come back, but point, I think I don't want to end up on such a negative point. And I think we've seen also, although this was a very much wide COP, and that there was a lot of complications from people from the global south, communities to join. We've seen a movement in the streets during the two big marches, but also during the People's Summit, we've seen a climate movement that was climate justice movement that has really engaged with very deep and conversations, strategizing as well. And I think this is also a very encouraging points that need to be taken out from the COP. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nassim. I really appreciate you sharing your initial thoughts, and we'll get into more of that, especially I think the People's Summit, in a little bit later in this event. So kind of moving on to some more specific questions. I'm going to start with you, Brandon. World leaders kind of started off the COP with their commitments towards climate action. Specifically, President Biden apologized for the previous administration's positions on climate change and stated that the US is back. So what are your reflections on the US positions at COP and the pronouncements made, and should we be optimistic? So love to hear your thoughts on the US's role at COP.
Thanks, Maria. So the US is back, for better or worse. I think undeniably it is better to have an administration that believes climate change is real, and at least parts of the administration genuinely want to do something about it, as opposed to the previous administration, which is really just a white nationalist, neo-fascist administration. Clearly what we have now is better than what we had before, but that's really not the bar, right? The bar is what does the United States need to be doing to address the climate crisis and meet its obligations to the rest of the world. And on that count, we are failing miserably, as always, right? So the US is back. There was an article that said the US is back, which means they're back to bullying other countries in the UN climate talks. And so, I think the example of loss and damage, which I talked about before, is indicative. The United States does not know how to negotiate from a place of global solidarity and from the perspective of what needs to happen in these negotiations to solve the climate crisis. The way that the US engages in these negotiations, and has always engaged in these negotiations, is what is best for the United States? How can we look good How can we be seen as climate leaders, but not actually commit ourselves to do too much, right? And that's exactly what happened at this COP as well. And so the US was deeply unhelpful on loss and damage, deeply unhelpful on finance, deeply unhelpful on ambition, deeply unhelpful, by the way, on that fossil fuels language, for which India took the blame for watering down. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The US has a key role there as well. And so, you know, John Kerry likes to make all these grand pronouncements about the leadership of the US, but what the US really came to the COP with, and this is true for many other rich countries as well, was a bunch of pre-planned announcements. The Biden administration had, I think, at least 10 senior level cabinet officials show up in Glasgow, and every single one of them had an announcement to make. And that's not what these negotiations are about, right? The COP is a space, a formally democratic space, right? At least, you know, we know in practice that you know, power politics and bullying plays a big role, but at least it's formally democratic, and it's a space where countries have a dialogue and come to agreements, mutual agreements. And instead, what the US and other wealthy countries did was make this parade of announcements, sort of UN General Assembly style, right? Which were not negotiated, not agreed, not reflected in NDCs, not verifiable, probably mean very little, or at best, right, or at worst, are greenwash for false solutions, like the Aim for Climate initiative that the administration announced on agriculture. It's actually a giant giveaway and political cover for agribusiness to continue a model of industrial agriculture that's destroying the planet and not helping farmer livelihoods either. That's what the US came to the COP with. They didn't come with any ability or desire to be constructive at the negotiating table. And I want to talk about this fossil fuel bit because I think it's quite indicative. So this, of course, was the language about fossil fuel phase out that got changed to fossil fuel phase down in the final text. And India is the one that made the intervention to weaken that text. And you know, the fact that this is the first time fossil fuels have been mentioned in UNFCCC text is wild, and I think indicative of the limitations of the process. And it's got to be much stronger. Nobody denies that. But interestingly, a couple of days before that closing plenary, India made an intervention in a negotiation saying that that language needed to be strengthened. It needed to be a phase down of all fossil fuels on an equitable basis. And there were two problems with that for the United States. One, obviously, is the equitable basis, because that means that the United States would have to do more faster than developing countries, and that's always been unacceptable to the US. The other was that the focus on all fossil fuels. The final text only focuses on coal. And it just so happens that US coal production has been declining for years, but the US has massive oil and gas expansion plans, larger than the next 5 countries combined. And in fact, just tomorrow, actually, the Biden administration is holding the largest lease sale for offshore oil and gas drilling in US history for parts of the Gulf of Mexico. So the US doesn't want oil and gas in the text because that would conflict with our plans to massively expand oil and gas production over the next 10 years. And focusing on coal puts the burden more on developing countries, in particular countries like India and China. And so when we blame India for watering down the text, it completely erases the role of the United States in making sure from the beginning that that text was never going to be strong enough, and favored US interests and shifted the burden to developing countries. Now, I should say that this isn't to absolve the Indian government, right? I'm certainly not defending a Modi government. I'm not saying that developing country governments shouldn't be doing more, and our friends in the global South are fighting every day to make that happen. But what I am saying is that we can't invisibilize the role of the US and the global North when we talk about these things, because this is all about global equity, right? And we need to balance the need for ambitious policies at home in all countries with the need for global equity and for the global North to take responsibility for its actions.
Thank you so much, Brandon. That's a really interesting point you made there. I would like to pass it on to Nassim now to kind of talk about the other side of the Atlantic and kind of the role of the European Union in these negotiations, and more broadly, like the EU's role as a climate change actor. So if you could speak to that, take it away, Nassim.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I totally can only totally agree with what Brandon has just said, underlying the fact that those countries don't know the language of equity and justice, and I think that's again what we've seen with the European Union coming into those negotiations. So yeah, it was mentioned before. The European Union resisted the calls from developing countries to create this facility providing financial support to the victims of the climate disaster. So to try to have this pool for loss and damage that would be immediately available. And the European Union was also, together with the US, an opponent in having the mention of oil and gas in the Glasgow Climate Pact, as Brendan has just presented a bit of the history of this process. So it is, however, it is clear that the historical responsibility of European Union countries like Germany, England, or France in global emissions, processes that are embedded into a ferocious colonial approach, is unquestionable, and they are among the biggest historical polluters, with a capitalistic class that has profited so much from extracting nature and human being in the South. So we knew before that the EU had never been a climate leader within those COP process, and yeah, especially not with a vision of justice and responsibility. But what we've seen also during this COP is from the European Union is maybe another level of double discourse, and I could say also maybe cynism. When we had Franz Timmermans coming into the plenary with a picture of his grandchild, asking for a deal to be concluded for next generation, it's then quite shocking when we know that the European Union was at the same time opposing this financing for this money for loss and damage. And I think this is something to really keep in mind, as it is also not really surprising, as it bluntly shows the real face of the European Union when it comes to tackle climate change and its effects, and how they play into the global climate governance. So the European Green Deal, I know it's maybe doesn't sound so related to the COP, but in fact, I think it is quite related, as it's like the way of how the European Union is seeing its climate actions. So the European Green Deal, the super climate change program of the European Union, with its net zero ambition towards 2050, while at the same time, and what we see in Europe is as well to continuing to massively push and to finance fossil fuels with gas and nuclear energy. It is also that same European Union, through the European Green Deal, that will create a tremendous acceleration of demands of minerals and rare earth under its European Raw Materials Alliance, with the effects of destroying land and habitats of rural and indigenous communities in Latin America and Southeast Asia. And it's also the same European Union and Green Deal that set up the framework for massive land grabbing and financialization of nature through the conditions attached to the European carbon market and its emission trading system, and that we are now also seeing at the global level, while untying the hand of financial markets and asset management firms to drive this process. So what I can hope is that maybe the action of the European Union during the COP will be maybe better portrayed by the media and analysts, and that some of the civil society and organizations that are really much pushing for European Green Deal without questioning it its impacts and the way it's being developed will try to rethink their position and to enter into a more critical dialogue with this program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nassim. Really appreciate your input on the EU's role in these climate change negotiations. You know, switching gears a little bit away from member states and governments, you know, I want to talk a bit now with Lucy and Tatet around the role of civil society at COP26. As Tatet mentioned in her earlier intervention, civil society had issued various calls to postpone the COP, given reasons of vaccine inequality in the global South. And then, you know, there was a lot of kind of tumult, if you will, in the run up to COP as to whether or not this was going to be happening, what countries were on the quote unquote red list, and a lot of concerns around quarantine issues and things of this nature, and actually rolling out vaccines into some of the developing countries so that these delegations would be able to attend. Obviously, the UK went ahead and had the in-person COP in Glasgow, and they declared this to be the most inclusive COP ever, which I find quite interesting that nearly everybody on this panel has mentioned how white it was. So I would love to hear you, Lucy, first kind of speak about your participation in the COP, how you feel about kind of the organization of it, the diversity of it, and you know, what were the challenges that you experienced both in your preparation for this year's COP and while at the events?
So I think one of the things is that in preparing for the COP, it was good preparing for it, but we had a bit of challenges in terms of looking at visas. And of course, we had to look at all these COVID requirements and so on. But when we got it, there was a lot of delays in the visa. And in fact, I think the UK government sent its evaluation for us, the survey. And I did put that because we waited and certainly we didn't know when we are getting. It was already past 16 days and so on, which it should not be happening because in all other countries, when you have a conference of parties, you're supposed to make it possible and give priority to those who have been invited already and registered. We also missed quite a number of indigenous people coming from Africa, especially from Africa, because they were delayed because of this visa, or they didn't get it on time, or they never got it at all, and the respondent also come. I think that saddened me a lot because it was a question of looking at if it is fully participatory, then let people who have applied to come. And if they don't have to come or the delays are done, it's always good when they're exposed. So those are some of the challenges I found, especially in preparation for the conference of parties. And I think for me, I was happy in a way that I really prepared the indigenous women from the rural community who are to come and decided, please just make sure you listen virtually, because I do not see the progress of how we are going to make it to the COP, comfortably and be able to get the process going. And I was right, but they were able to catch up in the virtual meeting and so on. I think indigenous people, for example, we tried as much as possible to make sure that despite the official side events which I'd mentioned, we also had our own pavilion where there were so many activities that took place, and also so many side events that took place. And that's where we also had our side event on trying to look at issues of indigenous women and climate, which I think for me was very good to be able to discuss that in such a big conference and to be able to have the rural women also be able to be heard. And the kind of study that we had done with Madre earlier on to look at the research we had done to make sure we could tell why and how do the women at the rural setting feel about climate change and what are the challenges and so on, which was really very good about it. I think also during the meeting, I found it very interesting because the meetings that I attended, the side events, I learned a lot. And I also was very happy because we discussed a lot on biodiversity, the post-2020 global framework, because our aim of going to the COP also was to look at how we can bring synergies between biodiversity and climate change and issues of desertification and so on, because they are all related. And we are trying to look at how these two, the convention, the Rio conventions can be able to work together and be able to bring some of the successes in different ways to the different COPs that we are in. So when the post-2020 global biodiversity was discussed and looking at issues that cause a lot of, which are underlying causes of biodiversity loss and the impact of climate change and also land degradation and so on, and deforestation and all that was really good for me. Discussing different high-level side events, which I feel like this was a good way to be able also to strengthen the awareness and the advocacy on the global framework, and also to see how these synergies can be brought together. We also discussed issues on One Health and looking at climate change, biodiversity loss, and land degradation, which also brought some synergies together and so on. So there were quite some issues that were discussed. There was also quite a number of youth that gave me a lot of hope, because I believe in empowering the youth and bringing that intergenerational link between the old and the young, so that they can be able to learn from the COP conference of parties and bring their own ideas. I also found the COP interesting in that sometimes they could allow people inside the conference area to do some demonstration, to do their own presentation as civil society. I think that's a good way, because they are trying to express themselves and trying to bring out their issues. And of course, we pushed on a lot on a human rights-based approach, which we hope that, because it's always a difficult way, we push on issues of human rights as earlier indicated, but there were still challenges for others to agree on them. But I think that was something that I also found it quite interesting, to give the people the voice and to give the people a little space to be able to raise their own issues, whether young or old, but civil society, to bring out some of the issues and to be able to speak back. And the other only disappointing thing that I had is, just as it was discussed earlier on, there were no very strong issues from Africa and Asia, despite that probably there could be a few countries which were really speaking a lot, but we wanted to see a bit more stronger issues. But I must say that I gained a lot also, and was able to capture a lot, and also both the disappointments and the challenge and the successes, but maybe the successes were slightly 70% and the other was 30%. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for sharing a little bit more about your experience. I would like to, pass it on over to Tet now and ask about, her experience. And, Lucy has, 70% positive kind of feeling, but specifically, with kind of the civil society sort of being pushed aside before the event, how do you feel about civil society's participation at COP this year? Tet, do you feel that, Lucy had mentioned earlier in the event that, it was hard to attend some of the plenaries, and sort of more of the high level stuff felt like kind of sectioned off away from civil society. So even if there was a really strong and really engaging civil society aspect to COP, how do you feel were leaders listening to what was happening on the civil society side of the event?
Yeah, I think I could be as optimistic as Lucy, no? Because coming to COP, civil society already had a lot of preparations in terms of, analyzing the issues at stake, mapping out our strategies, talking to each other, and also reaching out to the UK COP presidency, reaching out to other government delegations. So we know that when we get to COP, our demands are clear, and there have already been a lot of preparatory steps in order to push forward that advocacy. So we were clear about civil society asks in terms of the financing, in terms of raising the profile of loss and damage as a permanent COP agenda item, and also the corresponding dedicated financing that loss and damage needs to have. We were also very clear about our opposition and critique to the net zero narrative, and the false solutions under that are packaged as nature-based solutions. So there were a lot of preparatory steps before we reach that kind of consensus. But then when we reached the negotiations, initially the only places where civil society had access to were the restaurant, the supermarket, you know, and the exhibit area, where you see a lot of corporate interests are being pushed forward. Can you believe that there was also, you know, a very strong push for nuclear energy around COP? They were very aggressive, no, in handing out merchandise, literature that supposedly triumphs nuclear energy as a clean energy solution to climate change. We were also trying to speak with developing country representatives to help them, no, regarding their positioning and their demands. But what we noticed early, very early on in the negotiations is that rich countries were already very clear that number one, they could go as far as operationalizing the Santiago network and clarifying the functions, but not to the extent of actually resourcing loss and damage. No, the French delegation, the German delegation, in some of our bilateral meetings, made it very clear that having a dedicated financing facility for loss and damage is not the way to go. We also had a lot of discussions with the UK COP presidency, and then they said that, you know, it seems like the developing countries are making it hard for everyone to have meaningful outcomes at COP. So it was like, hello, did I hear it right? No, it's developing countries who are being stubborn and not wanting, you know, outcomes at COP, when in fact it's the rich countries very early on who said a lot about procedural stuff, you know, like moving all the discussions around long-term finance from the COP to the CMA or the Paris Agreement. Why? Because under the Paris Agreement, climate change is a global problem that everyone has to solve equally. Therefore, they are no longer bound to provide finances and other resources to developing countries as part of their historical responsibility. No, so we get tied up in a lot of seemingly procedural stuff, but behind it all is the very political push coming from rich countries to do away with all of the founding principles of the UNFCCC, no, that of common but differentiated responsibility, recognizing, you know, that it's a legal obligation to drastically reduce emissions up to a certain percent by a certain timeline. So now all of those founding principles of international climate diplomacy are being done away with this supposedly procedural thing of moving everything from COP to the Paris Agreement. So that is something that we needed to really be on guard against. But yeah, I think we were a little bit successful in terms of raising the profile of loss and damage. Before, it was just confined to technical discussions under the Warsaw International mechanisms. But because of civil society push, you know, never before has loss and damage been referenced in a COP cover decision. So I guess that is a good thing in terms of raising the profile and the need to have political discussions, you know, where decisions could actually be made at the political level and not just some technical body hidden somewhere under the UNFCCC. So that's a good thing, but more push needs to be done. It's also a good thing that probably because civil society was also quite good in unmasking and you know, demystifying net zero and really putting out all the negative implications of net zero and nature-based solutions. The COP presidency was not so much you know, praising in high heavens their net zero achievements. It was downplayed a little bit, no? Probably because everyone has been saying net zero is not zero. You know, that very direct messaging from civil society, it's very clear but very strong. And I think that also prompted the UK presidency team to downplay a little bit, you know, their supposed success at raising ambition for climate action. So there were some gains, but there was also a lot of pushback. And truth to tell, it was really very tiring in all of those 2 weeks because we didn't have access to a lot of this information. You know, we have to chase after negotiators. We have to constantly speak with the UK presidency who tells us this thing, but then we hear something different in plenary. So there's a lot of breakdown in communications also. And as Brandon said, it seems like it was not really a full intergovernmental negotiation because there were a lot of mini announcements from everywhere every day. It's like people are asking, did you read about the EU US China bilateral agreement for climate action? It's like, what? We didn't hear about that, but we read about that in some news report. No, so it's always constantly trying to uh, uh, be on top of all that's happening in the COP, in the formal negotiations, but also, you know, in bilateral corridor talks that have been happening. So I guess it was frustrating, but also challenging. But the level of civil society coordination, that was also very incredible in the last 2 weeks or so.
Thank you so much for that, Tatet. I would encourage anybody to either submit a questions in the chat or using the Q&A button, and we'll pass those along to the panelists. In the meantime, Brandon, I would love to hear from you, kind of responding to what Tatet just said, because you seem to have, you know, understandably some negative things to say earlier. And if we're working on this 60 to 70% positive, you know, how do you kind of respond to Tatet saying just at least raising the profile of loss and damage is a good thing, you know, and kind of what sort of positives could you see having come from COP on the financing side of all of this? Put you on the spot.
That's a hard question. I mean, I think Tatet is right. The raising the profile of loss and damage is huge. You know, it used to be that was inside baseball, UNFCCC talk. You know, the rule was don't talk in acronyms, and if you have to say the words loss and damage, you have to explain what they mean, right? And I think we might be getting to the point where it is more in common parlance, and certainly the people understand the concept, and that, you know, that's huge. On finance, you know, the thing that's being trumpeted as progress is I won't say commitment, but there's text about needing to double adaptation finance. And so there's recognition that adaptation finance is key, that we need to support communities, and that is equally important as mitigation finance. And it's not, it's getting short shrift. There's just not enough adaptation finance out there. So I suppose if I was reaching, I would call that a positive, although again, it's not a commitment, and it was not accompanied by any like language about increasing the overall amount of funding that's available, or even increasing the amount of grant financing that's available, which is what we need for adaptation, right? So, you know, take it with a grain of salt. I will say that, you know, as you mentioned, I was not physically there at the COP. And so I spent most of the last 2 weeks following remotely and in this sort of state of rage, right? Like listening to all the nonsense coming from the US in particular, trying to paint themselves as heroes. I was just like pissed off most of the time, forgive my language. And usually when you're at a COP, you feel that too. You feel that rage, you feel that anger, disappointment, sadness, all these negative emotions when you're following the negotiations and they're not delivering. But you also feel this inspiration, right, from being around all these amazing people from civil society, from movements who come together at these COPs to talk about alternatives, to talk about the better world that we need, to share experiences, to share learnings, to share meals, right? And, you know, I was sitting here in my house in Washington, D.C., and I didn't get to do any of that. And so I didn't get to see the really, like, truly inspirational, groundbreaking stuff that Nassim and Tatet and Lucy got to be part of. by being in the midst of those movement gatherings in Glasgow. And I think, I think that is where the hope always comes from at these conferences, not from the plenaries, not from the announcements, not from all the stuff that was accessible to me as someone watching from home. Maria, you are muted.
Sorry. No, I'll just direct you to the question that we got in the chat box. Natalie asked, we know that in COP21 liability was deleted from loss and damage because of pressure from the US. Is there at all an opportunity to make that liability clause come back? Could that be strategic for developing countries? Is this at all a possibility? Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, going back to well before Paris, and certainly at Paris, it became clear that that was an absolute red line for the United States, and it was pretty much a no-go. And I think there was a strategic decision that was made among civil society about, okay, it's not going to happen. Do we keep pushing it anyway? Because we know that's what we need and what would be the right thing to do. And kind of immediately, like during the Paris Agreement negotiations, we actually decided to step back a little bit from the liability language in the hopes of finding, something that would be acceptable to the US that was basically almost there, but not quite, right? I think developing country negotiators are in a different place and had to kind of step back from liability altogether, knowing that it would get them nowhere. Our role as civil society should be different, I believe. I will say, I don't see the US position on this moving ever, right? I think this will always be a red line for the United States. And so the question is, how do we do that? Do we really just amp up the pressure on liability as what we need and hope that we can shift the political landscape a little bit such that it opens a little bit of a window? Or do we, try to look for some different language, maybe around reparations, something that is, I think, just as strong language, but doesn't have the same necessarily legal implications that the US is afraid of? I don't know. That's a strategy conversation that has been ongoing and that I personally have not necessarily been super engaged in. So others may know more, but that it's certainly not something that's going to change in terms of a US position.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Can you maybe look at that next question we have there? This might be for you as well, Brandon. Or maybe Tatet would like to speak on this. Bruce wrote that we have through the WTO ISDS something we need to get rid of. Can this be used as a springboard for the liability issue? Do you want to speak to that, or should I pass that to Tatet, Brandon?
I'm happy to, but Tatet, go ahead if you.
I'm not so sure about the WTO ISDS, because the WTO is far less democratic, far less transparent than the United Nations system. Not that they're comparable, but I think what I'd like to add to this conversation is that that is also the reason why civil society has been pushing for, more evidence-based around loss and damage. That we could use, to strengthen our case around reparations, around liability, similar to what has been produced already, like the adaptation gap report. So we are also trying to see if we could have, UNEP, for instance, other UN agencies come up with the loss and damage gap report so that there could be that evidence-based, factual presentation that this is the amount of economic losses. Non-economic losses are harder to quantify, but there could be some methodology that could be used to somehow approximate it, because rich countries would always do everything that they could to avoid liability. That's a clear red line for them. But we can't let ourselves be tied down by that fact. So, if they are so stubborn on their position, then we have to even be more creative in finding a way through to navigate around this system. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'd actually like to pass it over now to Nassim to see if he could speak a bit about the People's Summit and that aspect of COP26.
Maria, and before Nassim speaks, maybe later on you can give me to answer a question from Kadir on nature-based solutions, but maybe first, Nassim, you can go ahead.
Please, Lucy, if you wanna go ahead with the
question which was,
answer.
thank you. The question which was there is that Kadir is asking, what is the standard for the Indigenous caucus on the nature-based solutions in the UNFCCC and the Convention on Biological Diversity, considering the deep concerns around them? And the governments are pushing for such a concept strongly, both for the UN. I think one of the important things about the nature-based solutions and looking at the discussion on UNFCCC and also for the climate change, the issue was that we are saying the nature-based solution, as Indigenous people, we have always used the nature-based solution at the community level. These are some of the things that we do. If it's plants, if it is food, if it's everything, we are used to that, and it's something that we have mainstreamed within our work in the community. But of course, there is this push because of looking at how restoration can be done and how we can be able to have a more of a nature-based kind of solution than what has already failed before. But you are also saying, even if we discuss about nature-based solutions, it has to be positive, not something that again will be introduced and come and damage the whole system again. It's something that we need to be involved. We are talking about Indigenous people, local communities, and other key players sitting together and deciding what they really need to do about nature-based solution, and give their ideas and give their knowledge, traditional knowledge which they use, so that it can be able to be used effectively. We are also talking about that it's very important to use a human rights approach to be able to work with different key players, to understand each other and put our heads together, not to just decide from nowhere as it has already been done before, and many issues never succeeded. So I think, Kadip, that is what I could be able to say, but we are pushing on to that, and we are saying the ecosystem restoration, we have to have Indigenous people, local communities fully involved, sitting down there and discussing and making decisions on different aspects, especially on the discussion on nature-based solution. Thank you, and Nassim, thank you for allowing me to answer that question.
Maria, you're still muted.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much, Lucy. And I'm actually going to pass to Nassim now to talk about the People's Summit.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, the People's Summit, well, Brandon was mentioning how uplifting it can be to really be surrounded by civil society and this kind of energy. And I think this was, again, one of the high moments of this COP, the People's Summit that went on during 3 days with different thematic assemblies, and trying also to raise the voices of the different constituencies that were negotiating during inside the COP, and trying to bring the exchanges that were happening inside, so bridging the gaps between the people that were outside, often protesting, and the people and the civil society inside. I think what it has showed as well is that so with this presence of frontline and indigenous communities, together with radical social movements and groups from the north, it has showed that the climate justice movement has not vanished with the pandemic, like some maybe want us to believe, like it was portrayed a bit quickly after the lockdowns, and so the movement is still very much there, still very much vibrant. And I think the level of discussions and the strategizing as well that I've seen during those days were really impressive, showing also kind of a degree of maturity of the movement. One interesting thing also was the solidarity that we've seen during some of the picket lines that were held by the cleansing workers in Glasgow, and many climate justice allies who went to join the picket lines, calling for social justice and really putting the fact that social justice is climate justice, and workers' rights is key as well. So I think those, I mean, definitely those were uplifting moments. The question, maybe we can enter a bit later in what would be the next step, and maybe also the needs for the climate justice movement to continue bringing those voices to maybe be able to set up an agenda that goes much beyond the COP as well, that is able to be differentiated by with the COP meetings and agenda. Was one thing I noted down during those discussions. But yeah, as a last point, I think that during those 4 days we've seen very such a large amount of presentations, discussions, and that we had also a feeling that there was like some inclusivity, although and some like being together, although we know it has been said before that there was a lot of struggle for people from the global south and communities to join that COP.
Thank you so much for that, Nassim. So, we don't have a lot of time left, so I would like to kind of go around and get, Nassim started this a little bit, kind of looking towards the future, and after this COP in Glasgow, what is next, and where do we go from here? What are the upcoming battles that you see yourself being a part of, at the local level, the national, regional, and global levels? So I will, I'll start with Titet.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of homework to do, at national level, because whatever's been agreed upon at the global level surely would be cascaded down here at the national level, even if on a voluntary basis. If any, I think our government would use, those global agreements to further legitimize and justify the false solutions, especially around the net zero and nature-based solutions. I think those two would be key elements in our struggles here at the national level, because we know from experience that this package of false solutions would be used, against indigenous communities, against smallholder farmers, against jeepney drivers, in the informal economy, all in the name of supposed climate action, all in the name of supposedly trying to lower down emissions. Our governments would be implementing, harsh mitigation actions, because that's our fear, because this climate package is so mitigation centric. Even countries that have very low carbon footprints would be pressured to do their own share, more than fair share of mitigation actions. And usually those have very serious implications for already poor, impoverished, disenfranchised communities. So I think that is where a lot of our energies would be at after COP, resisting those kinds of false solutions as it further displaces our people already trying to keep their heads above water, trying to survive, the impacts of the multiple crises of poverty, unemployment, landlessness, joblessness, COVID, and now in the name of climate action, we're going to see a lot more repression, a lot more violence from our government. So I think that is what needs to be clear. The struggle is on the ground, and we need to hold our governments really accountable, not to the corporations or shareholders, but to the real, the real climate actors, the people. Thank you.
Well, I will pass it to Brandon now.
Great. A couple years ago, ActionAid, my organization, identified finance and false solutions as sort of key areas where we wanted to push. And I think Tet has said what I would want to say about false solutions. On finance, we're at a really interesting moment where COVID really showed that the global north can mobilize massive amounts of money in a very short time if we decide collectively that we have a problem that we need to solve with public money, right? And at the same time, COVID has showed that the global north really doesn't care at all what happens in the global south, right? And that dynamic is obviously true in climate as well as in COVID. And so we're at this moment where these two crises happening at the same time have really shown us a couple of kind of conflicting things. And I think we really need our movements in the North to be more internationalist. And that's been kind of my struggle in the US for a long time, is getting internationalism into our increasingly vibrant domestic climate movement, right? But understanding that we have a particular responsibility to the rest of the world that we have to live up to, just on a purely ethical basis, but also on a purely pragmatic basis, that we're not going to solve this crisis without global solidarity. And so to me, in the global north, that is the real struggle, is making sure that, one, we actually get the public resources we need to bring to bear on these dual problems, but that we do that in a way that is globally equitable, that does take into account the needs and demands of the global south. So that for me, and sitting here in Washington, D.C. is the work.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Lucy, I'll pass it to you.
Yes, it's very difficult for me to say that I will be very positive on what's coming next. But as Tete has said, we'll be working together with other colleagues to follow up, and we'll be actually watching out. Already we're out in the field sharing our own experience and telling the communities what we have already learned and where we've come from. But we still have a lot of strategies to put down and be able to see how we can work together. We're also working with other CSOs on water, on different environmental issues, so that we can be able to coordinate and network together. And of course, we'll also be following up the global network, so that we can see how we can be able to mobilize things and look at the money that has already been given for indigenous people. How is it going to be disseminated to the people? What are the procedures that are going to be placed? What are the implementation and so on, before we arrive to Sharm el Sheikh in the coming years? But because you might not give me again maybe time, I would like to really take this opportunity also to thank RLS for supporting us and for being able to have our indigenous women and the young people to also attend the COP. This has been a very good partnership. We are now looking at climate change as part of us, as part of our process to follow up and to be able to participate. Thank you very much. And Andreas, thank you all for keeping up this particular partnership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And then, Nassim, you already talked about the need for an agenda that goes beyond COP, but, some final thoughts about the fights coming up.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, again, well, I'm trying to bring some different thoughts, but a lot have been said already. So I think for the climate movement, especially from the North, there is still very much the need to bring out the voices and to amplify the voices that are and the struggles that are there in the South, and to, as it was mentioned, especially try to unveil those false solutions, because those false solutions are will not so much impact directly people in the North, probably, but will have a direct and destructive impact for people in the South. Without, yeah, it can be that it's done on a scale and that is not like visible for civil society in the global North, or that is not portrayed in the right way. So I think that really the duty for the climate justice movements in the North is really to amplify those calls. I talk about the necessity to build an agenda on. I mean, those are discussions, and it's not me who is now like trying to push for this, but those were some of the discussions. What's coming next, which kind of coordination and amplification of those events, those gatherings that we've seen during the People Summit, to try also to build and to amplify the movement, to try to have a mass movement also in the North that would be able to pressure much more the states and to challenge the corporate interest. So I think those will be definitely the challenges that will be coming. And I really agree also on the question of the vaccines, the vaccine apartheid that we are seeing, and that we cannot separate from the fight for climate justice. We've seen that, the geopolitical forces, the vested interests are the main, and the power differences are the main accelerators right now of climate change. So if we want to fight against those results, we need to tackle those issues together. And thank you very much again.
Thank you. We're about ready to wrap up. I just wanted to say thank you to all of the panelists. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us, this morning, this evening, or relatively late at night if you're Tetet, but luckily, with jet lag, it's not that bad, I hope. No, and I think this has been super enlightening. I appreciate kind of all of your insight onto what it was like actually being in Glasgow over the past 2 weeks. I, for one, found it super interesting. And this was a really enlightening conversation, and I appreciate all of you being a part of it. Also, I'd just like to thank my colleague, Carrington, for helping on the back end with some of the technical Zoom stuff, and Andreas for being here and making some introductory remarks as well. So we don't have time, but I'm going to paste in the chat a video that Tetet wanted to share. So I'll leave you all with that. Please watch and enjoy. And thank you again for everybody for being a part of this wonderful conversation. Thank you and have a lovely day.
Thank you so much. Bye.